Well, welcome everybody to our second lesson on church history. And to those who are not able to join us live, we certainly welcome any feedback and the comments, or we're happy to answer any questions at church as well. But last week we talked about just sort of an overview of church history and the academic study of church history, as well as the state of Christianity in the world today, kind of presaging how we got to where we are. But this week, you can't really start any study in church history without first addressing the issue of the Jewish foundations of the faith. And so, does anybody know what this is right here?
Is it no, I can't remember the name of it. I just know it's.
Yeah, so you hear about the golden lampstands in the Bible, whether it be in the law in the first 5 books of the Bible with like the tabernacle and stuff, or I think in 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. I believe 1st Kings, when the temple was built, you hear about the golden lampstands. Does anybody know what the Hebrew word for golden lampstand is? You almost had it, Tori.
Menorah?
Yes, a menorah.
I wouldn't have said.
Yes, so many words. You already know more Hebrew than you think. So, yes, this is a depiction of a menorah, which is one of the traditional symbols of the Jewish faith. But as I said before, you can't have any real proper understanding of church history or any proper beginning of church history without first addressing the Jewish foundations of the Christian church. And that is where Schaff starts off in volume 1 of History of the Christian Church after his general overview. So with that, we will jump into it. So just a little bit of an overview of today's presentation. This is not exactly a strict outline. I can certainly talk about some of these things as we go. But the first thing is I will discuss some of the sources that we have on Jewish life in the centuries preceding the life of Christ, as well as that which is contemporary with the foundation of the Christian church, as well as sources that come after. We'll talk a little bit about the history of ancient Israel, going back into our Old Testament. We'll also talk about this very interesting group of people called the Samaritans. And then I specifically have entitled the fourth bullet point, hoi Judeoi, which is a Greek term. And it's an interesting phrase that we'll get into. And we will be discussing the hoi Judeoi, what we like to call Jews in our English language, but that may in fact be an anachronistic term. And so we'll talk a little bit about the various periods of Jewish history from the ending of the time of ancient Israel with the Babylonian exile, going on into the Achaemenid period. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Hellenistic period, though we will talk about that more next week when we talk about the sort of Greco-Roman and sort of pagan backdrop of the birth of the Christian church. We'll talk a little bit about the Hasmonean dynasty, as well as the Tanaim, the Tannaitic period of Judaism, which is sort of coextensive with the Second Temple, though it extends a little bit beyond that. And then we'll talk about Rabbinic Judaism as it is today. We'll cover the split between the church and the synagogue, and then we will also talk a little bit about Jewish history from the Second Temple to today. So starting off with Philip Schaff's History of the Christian Church, Volume 1, and this is his section on the Jews. This is page 54. He says, "As religion is the deepest and holiest concern of man, The entrance of the Christian religion into history is the most momentous of all events. It is the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. It was a great idea of Dionysius the Little to date our era from the birth of our Savior, Jesus Christ, the God-man, the prophet, priest, and king of mankind, is in fact the center and turning point, not only of chronology, but of all history, and the key to all its mysteries. Around him, as the sun of the moral universe, revolve at their several distances all nations and important events in the religious life of the world, and all must, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, contribute to glorify his name and advance his cause. The history of mankind before his birth must be viewed as a preparation for his coming, and the history after his birth as a gradual diffusion of his spirit and the progress of his kingdom. All things were created by him and for him. He is the desire of all nations. He appeared in the fullness of time, when the process of preparation was finished and the world's need of redemption fully disclosed. And with that, we will begin our discussion of the first half of that preparation. So the sources that we have for Judaism and for the Jewish foundations of the Christian church, first and foremost is the Tanakh. Does anybody know what Tanakh means in Hebrew? Has anybody heard of this phrase before? Does anybody know what the Tanakh is?
Or don't.
I've heard of it. It's like the Old Testament, isn't it? It's like the 5 books of
Yes.
Old Testament.
Yes. Well, you're close. So Tanakh is actually an acronym. The Hebrew letters Tav, Nun, and then there's sort of a vowel pointing accent thing here, and then I believe this is Kaf at the end. And so the Old Testament is divided into 3 different sections: the Torah, which is the law, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and then the Ketuvim, which is the writings. So for those who are familiar with your Old Testament, you can probably take a guess as to what those divisions are. The Torah being obviously the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses. The prophets being prophetic books such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Lamentations, that the early Christian writers called the major prophets, and then obviously the minor prophets. Books like Micah, Hosea, Haggai, Habakkuk, so on and so forth, Zechariah, Malachi. And then the Ketuvim is Hebrew for the writing. So these would be like the Psalms or the Proverbs or the historical books like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Though sometimes 1st and 2nd Samuel is included under the Nevi'im, the prophets, because Samuel himself was a prophet. So the Hebrew Old Testament is obviously the very first source that we have. It's the earliest source of the Jewish people and the Jewish religion, because it is, in fact, the ancient record of the people of Israel, as well as Holy Scripture. The second is the Talmud, which is divided into 2 parts traditionally. There is the first part, which is the Mishnah, which is a compilation of oral Pharisaic traditions that have sort of written around the year 200 by a particular Jewish rabbi, Judah Hanasi. That's literally Judah the Prince in Hebrew, who was a rabbi in Galilee around 200 AD. And it was his attempt to preserve the teachings of the Pharisees from prior to the destruction of the temple. And so he wanted to preserve those traditions before they were lost in the midst of time. The second part of the Talmud is the Gemara, from the Aramaic phrase gemar, which is to complete. And so it's the idea of the completing of the teachings or the sayings of the Mishnah. And so the first part of the Gemara with the Mishnah is the Jerusalem Talmud, since this was completed in the first few hundred years of the year of our Lord. And then the Babylonian Talmud is the Mishnah and the earlier Gemara, along with the later Gemara, which was compiled in Mesopotamia around the year 500 AD. And so you may hear about the Jerusalem Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi, and then the Talmud Babli, which is the Babylonian Talmud. So these contain numerous historical references, teachings of rabbis, great sayings, stories that are sort of extra biblical traditions that were preserved for posterity by these Jewish rabbis. And so there is a lot in the Talmud. I believe you could go onto Chabad's website and find a nice online version of it. But yes, the Talmud gives us a lot of really important information, especially as it relates to some of the traditions that we even see in the gospel narratives are recorded in the Talmud, such as the Korban rule from Matthew 15. A really, really important early writer is this individual over here. This is Josephus, who is an early first century Jewish historian, actually kind of mid-first century Jewish historian, who was caught up in the First Jewish-Roman War. He was initially on the side of the Jewish rebels, but as Vespasian and his armies marched through northern Israel, Josephus actually switched allegiances and was taken as a sort of personal servant and historian by the emperor himself, and recorded for Vespasian, the emperor, the future emperor, a very important work called the Antiquities of the Jews, which records much of the extra biblical and sort of, early historical writings, early historical stories of the Jews, and is a compilation of their history. So we know much about Jewish history, especially from the time of the destruction of the first temple all the way down to the first Jewish-Roman War due to Josephus. So he records a lot of really important details in the Antiquities of the Jews. And there's, I believe, a 12-hour recording or more on YouTube that you can go listen to. Philo of Alexandria is another important early Jewish writer. I believe he was writing in the 1st century BC. He was a Jew, but he was a Hellenized Jew. So he spoke Greek and was well acquainted with Greek philosophy and sort of Greek culture and Greek religion. And many of his early ideas sort of found their way into discourse between early Jews and Christians. The Dead Sea Scrolls are another important source of historical information for us. We'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls later. And there are also Roman sources, such as Tacitus and other early Roman writers who talk about Jews in this period of history. So Philip Schaff, once again quoting him, "This preparation for Christianity began properly with the very creation of man, who is made in the image of God and destined for communion with God, and destined for communion with him through his eternal Son, and with the promise of salvation which God gave to our first parents as a star of hope, to guide them through the darkness of sin and error. Vague memories of a primitive paradise and a subsequent fall, and hopes of a future redemption survive even in the heathen religions. With Abraham, about 1900 years before Christ, the religious development of humanity separates into two independent and, in their compass, very unequal branches of Judaism and heathenism. These meet and unite at last in Christ as the common Savior, the fulfiller of the types and prophecies, desires and hopes of the ancient world, while at the same time the ungodly elements of both league in deadly hostility against him, and thus draw forth the full revelation of his all-conquering power of truth and love." So just another quote from Schaff about the backdrop of Christianity. So where do we begin? We first talk about ancient Israel. And so the history of ancient Israel is divided up into several different time periods, the first of which we find in the book of Genesis, which is the time of the patriarchs, which is roughly from about 2150 BC to maybe around 1850, to some people want to extend it out to maybe 1700 BC. And the patriarchs are, of course, and I have their Hebrew names here. Does anybody know, can guess who these the patriarchs are?
Jacob,
Mm-hmm.
because Yokov or something.
Uh-huh. Does anyone want to take a stab at pronouncing the Hebrew? The Hebrew. I gave the English transliteration.
I guess. So you got Jacob. Is Isaac one of them?
Yes, that's right. And then who is the first patriarch?
Oh, Abraham.
Yes. So we have Abraham, who's the father of a multitude. We have Yitzhak, which is he laughs. And then we have Yaakov, who is later Israel. And of course, Yaakov is the one who grabs by the heel, but then is renamed after he fights with God at Penuel as he who strives with God. And so, because Jacob fought with God, and so that's where we get our term Israel from, is from Genesis. The word Hebrew, which you see in our scriptures, both in Genesis as well as from the book of Hebrews. This is a term that is kind of synonymous with Israelite in the ancient world, and it comes from the sort of Semitic root word avar, which is he who crosses over. And what this is pointing to is the fact that Abraham was not a native of the land of Canaan. Does anybody know where Abraham came from? We can just shout them out.
Was it Canaan? Oh, Philistia? I don't know.
Remember, Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, which is in Mesopotamia or modern day Iraq. So, as a Hebrew, the Canaanites would have called him that word because he was from one who was across the river. So, it is a reference to the peoples who were moving from Mesopotamia down into the Levant in the first half of the second century or the second millennium BC. And so that's where we get our term Hebrew from. And so after the time of the patriarchs, there is the period in which the children of Israel spend in Egypt, about 1400 or about 400 years. And then you have the period of Moses and the Exodus from about 1450 BC to 1410 BC. After Moses' death, the rulership of, or the leadership of the children of Israel is passed on to Joshua, who is the first of the Shaphatim, which is judges in Hebrew. So these are the people who essentially God raised up. They were not kings in the sense of the later monarchy, but they would be sort of redeemers that God would raise up to save the people from their enemies. Then you have the United Monarchy, which existed for about 100, 150 years, something like that, if you want to include the reign of Saul, maybe about 100 years. And this includes the reigns of King Saul, King David, and King Solomon, in which all of the tribes were united under one political entity. And then after the death of Solomon in the year 932 BC, the kingdom is divided into two different realms. In the north, we have what becomes the kingdom of Israel. And so this is ruled over by a number of various dynasties for the 200 or so years that this kingdom existed. And then in the southern half of the Israelite domain, you have what becomes the kingdom of Judah, and that is significant for our later discussion, where the tribe of Judah, along with the tribe of Benjamin, maybe just a little bit of the tribe of Simeon and some of the Levites as well, continue to be ruled over by the house of David, all the way down to the time of the destruction of the first temple. And does anybody know what this is right here?
I'm not seeing where you're pointing. Oh,
This little inlet down here in the lower right of the screen.
Is that the obelisk or something?
Sort
I was
of.
guessing.
It's certainly etching on stone.
is it our
So-
first recording of scripture that we have?
I'm not sure exactly what this says, but this is actually the Paleo Hebrew alphabet. So if you go to Blue Letter Bible and you look for the Old Testament and you pull up the sort of Hebrew text that's underneath our English translations, you'll see it written in a different alphabet. That's actually a later alphabet. The original scriptures probably would have been written in this alphabet, which is among the most primitive writing scripts that we have. So this is actually the ancient Paleo Hebrew alphabet, which is very similar to the alphabet that the Phoenicians would have used. And so if you go to Israel, some of the oldest monuments and some of the oldest inscriptions that you'll find in the land are actually written in this script. And so this is actually probably what the original writings of the Bible would have looked like in ancient times. But we'll discuss more of the history later on. So, as I mentioned, after the death of Solomon, the United Monarchy is divided into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel was ruled by a succession of dynasties unrelated to the house of David and was finally destroyed for its wickedness and idolatry, as recorded in the Chronicles as well as in 2 Kings, by the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted about a century and a half longer until finally being destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar in the year 586 BC. And legend has it that the first temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av, which is, I say the 9th of August, but it's really the 9th of the month of Av, which is roughly correspondent with August, in 586 BC. Which is also, according to legend, the exact same day that the second temple was destroyed 6.5 centuries later. And so Tisha B'Av is one of the most important days in the Jewish calendar today, and it is a day of mourning for Jews who weep over the destruction of the temples. And this little inlet down here in the bottom right is an artistic rendering of the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. Right. So after the destruction of both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah by the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, respectively, the people of Judah go into exile in Babylon. And while they are there, not everybody is deported. Going back to the prior Assyrian conquest, one of the things that ancient kings in the Middle East would do is when they would conquer an area, they would often displace its population. And so that would allow them to bring in foreigners into a new area who are loyal to the dynasty as opposed to being loyal to the local rulers that had existed beforehand. And so we have an interesting record of this in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 17:24. When it says the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cutha and from Ava and from Hamath and Sepharvaim and settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. And this is according to Jewish tradition, the origins of this people who actually still exist to this day in the Holy Land, the people that we know as the Samaritans. So the Samaritans have their origins in the division of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And it's kind of an interesting word, Samaritan. It's thought to have sort of a dual etymology. Both the city of Samaria in the northern kingdom, which was the capital of the northern kingdom, as well as the Hebrew word shamarim, which are the guardians or watchers. And the idea is that they are a people who are guarding or watching the Torah that God had handed down to Moses on Sinai. The Samaritans see themselves as the true followers of the ancient Israelite religion. And they actually view Jews as the corrupt followers of the priest Eli, who we read about in 1 Samuel chapter 1, whom they say shifted the tabernacle from Mount Gerizim, where it had been before, to Shiloh or Shiloh. And so subsequently, they say the Jews further corrupted the religion by building a temple in Jerusalem. And we see this conflict between Jews and Samaritans in John chapter 4, where Jesus meets the woman at the well. And they actually have a religious disputation where the woman says, our fathers say, that it's right to worship God on this mountain, and you Jews say that it's right to worship God in Jerusalem. And Jesus, of course, says, we Jews worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. You Samaritans essentially worship what you do not know, but an hour is coming and now is when God's true worshipers will worship him in spirit and in truth. But we see, even in the pages of the New Testament, a deep enmity that the Samaritans have with the Jews, as these are kind of the two peoples that descend down to us from ancient Israel. The Jews, on the other hand, have their own view of the Samaritans, as you all may have heard in Sunday schools or in sermons down throughout the years. The Jews view the Samaritans as a mixed people who have both Israelite ancestry, but who are also descended of the very foreigners that the Assyrians imported into what was once the northern kingdom after the Assyrian conquest. They had a rival temple on Mount Gerizim that was destroyed by the Maccabees under John Hyrcanus in 110 BC. And so, question for y'all. Why is Mount Gerizim this important place to the Samaritans? Does anybody have any idea why the Samaritans might consider Mount Gerizim to be an important place in divine history?
Do they think that's the mountain that Moses received God's law?
So, sort of. You're on the right track, Tori. If you go to the end of Deuteronomy, as the people are receiving blessings and cursings as they're about ready to begin the conquest, Moses takes some people and stands them on Mount Gerizim, and he takes other people and stands them on Mount Ebal. And so, as God is giving his sort of instructions to the people, he gives his curses on Mount Ebal. So if the people fail to uphold the Torah, all of the curses that God had mentioned on Mount Ebal would fall upon the people. However, if they were faithful and true to the law, then God would give them all of the blessings that he gave to the people on Mount Gerizim. And it's like, all right, that's great. Well, Mount Gerizim is kind of early in the canon of the Tanakh, why would the Samaritans consider Mount Gerizim as opposed to, say, Jerusalem, where Solomon's temple was built, to be the holiest place on earth? Anybody have any ideas why that might be? And there is a hint on the screen.
They get closer.
I have no idea.
So the Samaritans actually only have the first 5 books of Moses as canon scripture. They actually reject the rest of the Tanakh. They do not consider the Nevi'im or the Ketuvim portions of the Tanakh to be divine revelation. They consider only the Torah to be divine revelation. And so, where is the last place in the Torah that God is said to meet with his people?
Is Mount Gerizim?
Mount Gerizim, where he gave the blessings prior to the conquest. And so that is why the Samaritans consider Mount Gerizim to be the holiest place, because it's the last place, in their view, that God spoke to the people of Israel prior to the conquest of the land and the giving of the law. So what's very interesting about the Samaritans, if you look at this writing up here at the top, the Samaritans actually, their alphabet is actually a direct descendant of Paleo-Hebrew. And so you may notice the symbol is very similar to one of the Paleo-Hebrew symbols that we saw earlier. Unlike the Jews who spent time in Mesopotamia after the Babylonian captivity, the Samaritans were always in the land of Israel, and so they continued to use the old Paleo-Hebrew script, and over time, that script developed into what we call the Samaritan script today. So this is actually an older script than the Asuri script that the Jews use today. And that is because the Jews actually use the script that the Babylonians and the Assyrians would have used to write the Aramaic language. And so it's actually the Royal Aramaic script that is what the Jews write the Old Testament in today, and what sort of the Hebrew language is written in. Whereas the Samaritan written language is actually closer to the original Hebrew that would have been written in ancient Israel, because they didn't spend time in exile in Mesopotamia. And so this is a very old community. They have very old traditions. And about 1,000 Samaritans actually still exist in the vicinity of the Palestinian city of Nablus, which is the Roman city Neapolis, which is built on the site of ancient Shechem from the Bible. And so they're right there in the heart of the West Bank, the northern part of the West Bank, near the heartland of what was once the northern kingdom of Israel. And so this is the Samaritan high priest, and these are all the Samaritan people there on Mount Gerizim, and they're getting ready to have their ceremony there, which continues to this day. So any questions about the Samaritans before we move on? Right.
Oh, dang it.
Was that Jonah?
So you said that like there's a small group of Samaritans that still live in the near that mountain area in West
Yep.
Bank, you said?
Yep.
Okay. That's super interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Was it. I don't know if I have any questions.
Yeah. They've actually done a lot of DNA testing on the local Palestinian population there, the Muslim and Christian population, mainly Muslim today. And they have shown that there are a number of Palestinian families that do seem to have Samaritan ancestry. And so this people is definitely one of the indigenous peoples of the Holy Land, and it's rather remarkable that they still persist to this day, even in such reduced numbers.
So like, are they like a mix of between Palestinians and Jews, I guess, or
No, they predate the Palestinian population. If anything, there are Palestinians today who have Samaritan ancestry rather than vice versa.
The Samaritans
Yeah, I
are
get them.
dwellers, whereas Palestinians came later.
Yes.
No, I
Yeah.
know that. I was just like, I thought, aren't Palestinians descendant from like Arabs or something?
That is a very complex topic that's
Okay,
beyond
sorry.
the scope of this lesson. But I will say that modern day Palestinian Arabs have both ancestry from the indigenous populations of the Holy Land, as well as some admixture from the Arabian Peninsula due to the Arab conquest. But they're not entirely Arabic,
Okay.
and they're not entirely from the Arabian Peninsula. Palestinians do have a very um, large percentage of their ancestry that is from the original indigenous inhabitants of the land. But over time, they were forcibly converted to Christianity and then later forcibly converted to Islam.
Right.
Any other questions?
Is that the only pocket of Samaritans that we're aware of?
Yep. They all have Israeli citizenship. And according to Jewish royal courts or the Jewish courts today, the religious courts there in Israel, the Samaritans are considered Jews. They actually, it's kind of funny, their population had gone into decline, and so they needed to bring in people to help keep up the population, and so they actually imported several hundred Ukrainian women to marry Samaritan men after the fall of the Soviet Union, and so there's actually Ukrainian ancestry among Samaritan families today. Uh,
I would have thought like Armenia or something.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
yeah. So yes, that's how they've kind of helped um, maintain their population. But this is one of the challenges that endogamous populations have. Does anybody know what the term endogamy means?
If I had to guess, does that mean like they only marry within their like race, maybe?
Exactly. And not so much race is kind of a problematic term, but only within their sort of people, within their ethnicity, their population.
Yeah, I should have said that.
So, like the Amish are kind of that way. The early Mormon pioneers were kind of that way. Gypsies or the Romani people in Europe are another sort of endogamous population. And when they do DNA studies, it's one of the ways that they know that the Samaritans, they're kind of the closest of all of the modern day populations, at least genetically, to the ancient inhabitants of the land because they've only married amongst themselves. If a Samaritan woman ended up marrying out, either to a Jew or to a Christian or later to a Muslim, that Samaritan woman's descendants would no longer be strictly Samaritan, and so her, lineage would be sort of lost to the larger population. Whereas people who continue to marry endogenously or within the group continue to perpetuate their lineage.
I bet that's a big problem with only 1,000 people to mingle with.
Yeah, hence the Ukrainian the Ukrainian issue there.
I guess
So
that's a desperate point for that because what was the justification for it? I guess just the desperation of
just
it.
not enough women to marry,
Yeah.
that the population was going to die out if they didn't have people come in to the community and to help perpetuate the community.
It's so interesting.
Because the local Muslim population, it's just a non-starter there. So they had to go outside of Israel to find women who would be willing to come and join this community. All right. Any additional questions about the Samaritans? If not, we will continue on to the next slide, and we're going to start talking about hoi judaioi. And this is a term that is drawn directly from the New Testament. So I want to read this first. In his book Dominion, the British historian Tom Holland challenges the idea of Judaism as a coherent religion and eschews the term Jew in favor of the term Judean. And so I have a question here for the audience. Is the term Jew an ethnic term or is it a religious term?
Both.
Jonah has sliced through the trick question. How is it both?
It's a part of Judah, just shortened to Jew.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Judah came biblically rather than.
Yep.
But it also describes their ethnicity as well.
Yeah. So I think the term that modern sociologists would use would be the term an ethno-religious community. Other communities you could think of, I mentioned earlier, like the Amish or, the early Mormon pioneers, were a small group of people who married within each other. And so if you were part of that ethnicity, you had that religion. And if you were part of that religion, you were descended from people from that particular ethnicity. So it's what we would call an ethno-religious group. The reason Tom Holland, which I don't always agree with everything he writes in his books, but he provides some interesting food for thought. And this is something I think you'll see as we go through church history. Much of how we think about religion, not just in the modern West, but even globally, is really an invention of Christianity. If you go to India, you think of India as a land of Hinduism. Well, is Hinduism really a coherent, singular religion in the way that we would think about the Christian religion? The answer is no. There's hundreds, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of different sects and subsects of what we sort of lump together as quote unquote Hinduism. The idea of Hinduism itself is really an artifact of British colonial rule, which is taking Christian ideas and Christian norms and sort of reading other religions through those eyes. And this will become very significant, especially as we jump into our discussion of Greco-Roman religion next week. So much of our world today really is Christian, not just explicitly, but even more so implicitly. That's why we can think of, ideas like communism or wokeism. These are Christian ideas. Now they're heretical ideas, but you could never get communism from, say, an Islamic worldview or a Buddhist background. You could never get wokeism from a Shintoistic worldview. The ideas of many of our modern social movements, as well as our very understanding of religion itself. Even Islam, in a sense, has been Christianized in this way. The sharp division between Sunni and Shia, all the different schools sort of seeing themselves now in this very categorical way. That's really a product of Christianity in the West. Hence the title of the book, Dominion. The ancient world did not view religion the way that we view it today. There was no private sphere called religion, and then you had the state. Even paganism itself there is no paganism, it's paganisms. You have hundreds of different local cult shrines and local deities that are sort of all amalgamated together. And you have, yes, the writings of poets and philosophers about, Zeus coming to Earth and, impregnating a female woman to give birth to the hero Hercules, or, Cronus eating his children, and then, those children rebelling against him, and, the Olympians overthrowing the Titans. These are all just sort of loose stories. And what I think Holland successfully argues in his book is that um, the idea of Judaism as a religion is really a Christian idea, in that Jews in the first century, who really Judean, the people who follow Judaismos, which is the way of the way of the Judean, the sort of Judeanness, the way that you have Hellenism as the sort of way, the sort of folk ways of the Greeks. This idea that you had a sort of singular Judaism really only emerges in the Christian era. And we'll kind of see that flesh itself out, as we start talking about the various Jewish sects. So I think it's a very provocative way to think about things, that when we talk about the Jewish origins and the Jewish foundations of Christianity and sort of first century Judaism, we're really talking about the indigenous religious practices of a people. And the term Jew that we use today is really a concept. The way we think about modern Jews is really a concept that develops over the course of the past 2,000 years, primarily in opposition to the Christian church. And so, is the term Jew an ethnic or religious term? And the answer, as Jonas says, is both. Does anybody have any kind of follow-up or thoughts about that?
It's just kind of cool.
Yeah.
All I'd say.
So it's where we get our term Jew. It comes from Judea, the ancient region of Judea, which is descended from the southern kingdom of Judah. And so, yeah, that's where we get our term. Jesus himself is a Judean. He is he's a descendant of the tribe of Judah. And so the religion and the practices that developed amongst that people is what we call Judaismos, or what sort of later develops into this idea of Judaism as we understand it today. But if we would have taken our modern conception of what Jews and Judaism are back into the first century, it would be anachronistic. They wouldn't have thought about themselves in the way that we think about them today. They would have had a different self-conception.
It's interesting that you brought the book up, because I almost bought that book. And now I feel like I should.
Well, Holland is certainly to our left, and we would disagree with a number of his conclusions. Right. But I think a lot of the data and the arguments that he makes certainly give some food for thought, especially in the area of historical study.
Mm.
All right. Well, we'll talk about the timeline of Hoi Judaioi, the Jews, as it is translated in our Christian New Testament. So we start with the destruction of the temple in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire, comes through, besieges Jerusalem, carries off the royal seed and the captives to Babylon, where they are there for about 70 years. During this time, they adopt the Aramaic language, as I mentioned earlier. They begin using the Aramaic script to write their language, including the Jewish Old Testament. And during this time period, you have the beginnings of synagogue life. With the temple gone and the people out of the land, they begin to develop a new sort of locus of religious life in the synagogue. 532 BC, Cyrus the Great, the king of the Achaemenid dynasty of Persia, marches into the city of Babylon, having overthrown Belshazzar, and restores the worship of Marduk in the city, and he establishes a new dynasty ruling over Babylon that had come from Persia. He issues his decree of return, and so this is where the books of Ezra and Nehemiah come in which Ezra the priest and Nehemiah the governor lead the exiles back to the land. But they only lead some of the exiles. There are many Jews who decide to stay in Mesopotamia, and you have a diaspora community that will exist all the way up until modern times, not just in Mesopotamia, but that moves around the world. And so they reinstate Torah practice as well as rebuild the city, and they also construct the second temple under Zerubbabel. And this is governed, the land of Israel at that time is governed as a satrap of the Persian Empire called Yehud Medinta. Yehud Medinta. So you can see already that term Yehud, which is from the root Judah in the name. 332 BC is one of the most important years in the history of the ancient world. For the Persians ruled much of the known world for about 200 years, but then almost out of the blue, one of the most significant figures in ancient history and in the ancient world arises in the northern Greek kingdom of Macedon, and that is, of course, Alexander the Great. The young prince sets out to conquer the known world. He overthrows the massive Persian Empire with his superior tactics and his professional army, with the phalanx and the heavily armored infantry known as the hoplites. They literally, as a kingdom, a single kingdom, overthrow the greatest empire the world had ever known to that point. And they were led by this charismatic young ruler in Alexander the Great, who's one of the most significant figures in world history. As he is conquering the known world from the Persians and overthrowing the Persian Empire, he comes to the city of Jerusalem, as legend has it, in the year 332 BC, and I believe this is told in Josephus. And he is met outside the walls of Jerusalem by the high priest of the Jews, who comes bringing tribute and offering, not religious offering, but sort of political homage. And the priest tells Alexander who they are and what they're doing, and about this ancient sanctuary that they had. And he says, well, we can't obviously worship your gods. We can at least offer sacrifice to our God on your behalf. And so Alexander accepts the submission of the city of Jerusalem and allows the Jews to continue their cultural practices so long as they acknowledge Alexander as their secular king. Even the term secular there is problematic. But what this does is it brings in a different kind of pressure than the pressure that the Jews had faced in Babylon. Whereas before, they were a minority group living in a large cosmopolitan empire, that empire was very tolerant of different ideas and local beliefs and local practices. And the kings of Babylon and Persia tended to leave their subjects alone in terms of sort of local custom and religious practice, and didn't necessarily go about seeking to Persianize the culture and the religions of the people around them, or even the language. The Persians just accepted the Aramaic language that the Babylonians and the Assyrians had used before in their western provinces. That's not so with the Greeks. Alexander did not just set out to conquer the world, but he set out to change the world, to fundamentally Hellenize the world, to bring in Greek culture and language and philosophy, ways of thinking, ways of doing. And so this is a different sort of pressure than the pressure that the Jews had faced before, and that is the pressure of assimilation. It's the idea that as you adopt another people's language and you begin to interact with their religious tradition and their philosophy and their culture, their food, their clothing, that over time you start to lose your own distinctiveness. And so, whereas the Persians may have ruled over the Jews politically, the Greeks sought to strike the Jewish identity at its very soul, and that was to change the Jewish identity. And this has very significant effects in the 2nd century BC, as we'll talk about below. But one of the really significant events, and this will be repeated throughout our church history study, is that the Old Testament is translated from Hebrew into Greek during the Hellenistic period. And so around the year 200 BC, there was a very large Jewish community that lived in Alexandria, Egypt. And as legend has it, I love this story, though it's probably very much a legendary story and not actually historical, that 72 scholars over 72 days translated the entire Old Testament, and they all came up with the exact same Greek phrasing from the original Hebrew. And so this was seen as a form of inspiration. And so this is the legendary origins of the Greek Septuagint, or the 70, is where you can kind of see the root word of Septuagint, or Septuagint, homage to the 70 there. And so this becomes the Bible of the Jewish diaspora in the Eastern Mediterranean, because it's the language of the common people. Greek begins to replace Aramaic and other languages in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East as the language of commerce and the language of trade and culture. And so the Septuagint comes to have a primacy of place amongst Jews living outside the land of Israel. And this is very significant for us as Christians, because when we see Old Testament quotations in our Christian New Testament, you'll notice if you read your Old Testament and then you'll compare to a New Testament quotation of the same verse, there may be some slightly different wording. And that is because the New Testament is not quoting from the underlying Hebrew. And the vast majority of cases, it is quoting from this Greek manuscript tradition called the Septuagint. And so this has a very important effect upon the transmission of the New Testament and how the early Christians saw the Bible as the Greek language is the language of Christianity in the early centuries rather than Hebrew. And this opens up Christianity beyond the scope of just Jews, but even to Gentiles. And this is significant in the early history of the Christian church. So after a period of about 170, 160 years or so of Hellenistic rule, first under Alexander and then under the Diadochi, his generals who take over after his untimely death in 323 BC, you had the Ptolemaic Empire ruling over Egypt, which is one of Alexander's empire's successor state, and then the Seleucid Empire in Asia Minor and in the east. Now the eastern provinces of the Seleucid Empire are later overthrown by the Parthian Empire, but the Seleucid Empire lasts all the way up until the 1st century BC, when we'll talk about the next period. But there was a Seleucid king by the name of Antiochus IV. So he was a Greek king ruling over Syria and Asia Minor, and subsequently Judea. he tried to Hellenize Judea, and he wanted to eliminate Judaismos, but he fails to do so. And this is the story of Hanukkah, and is captured in um, the apocryphal works of the Maccabees, which is part of the Old Testament Apocrypha and the Septuagint. And under the Maccabees, who are a family of priests, so they are Kohens in Judea, they overthrow Greek rule, and for about 100 years, Judah is actually once again an independent nation. Under the rule of the Maccabees, who are alternatively called the Hasmoneans. And so this is the Hasmonean dynasty that rules over Judah. Does anybody know where the story of Hanukkah is actually referenced in our Bible, our canonical scriptures? Does anybody know what Hanukkah means in Hebrew?
Maccabees or Maccabees? Maybe I don't know.
Tori, can you turn to John chapter 10?
Sure can.
Or you can pull it up on your computer screen.
Oh, I have my phone out. I don't have a camera on my computer. You said John 3?
John chapter 10.
Oh, 10. Sorry.
And if you can go to verse 22.
All right, that would be at that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was a winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple.
Yep. All right, you can stop there. So where is the feast of dedication mentioned in the first 5 books of Moses?
I don't think it's there, is it?
No, it's not. That is actually the correct answer, because the Feast of Dedication is not one of the 3 major Jewish feasts. The Hebrew word for dedication is Hanukkah. And so Jesus was actually in Jerusalem during winter, because which Jewish holiday is famously close to Christmas? And that is the holiday of Hanukkah. And the holiday of Hanukkah is actually celebrating the rededication of the temple after its desecration by Antiochus IV, and the successful revolt of the Hasmoneans. And there's something about a miracle with the golden lampstand, and how the oil doesn't run out, and that they're able to eventually, get out of the siege and defeat the evil king, and they gain their independence again. And so by the time of Jesus, Hanukkah is actually a celebrated holiday. And what I find most interesting in the canonical scriptures, the only place that Hanukkah is mentioned is actually in the New Testament, not in the Old Testament.
Wow.
So there's a little bit of New Testament trivia for you. However, the good times were not meant to last. And as is always the case, most dynasties have their downfall in internal squabbles and internal disputes. And so there were 2 rival claimants to the Hasmonean throne. And in 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great is called in to mediate this dispute between these 2 claimants. And instead of mediating the dispute, what do the Romans typically do?
Mutiny.
They decide to take over themselves. They mediate the dispute by ending both parties and taking over. And so Pompey the Great sacks the city of Jerusalem. He goes into the temple itself, and he gets into the Holy of Holies, and guess what he finds? Nothing. It's empty. He was expecting to see a great idol. And then yet he gets in there and there's this empty room. And he had obviously slaughtered many priests and Levites on his way into the temple. And he had wondered why they had so zealously guarded this place that had no idol. And it puzzled Pompey. And the Romans thought this a very strange thing, that there would be no pagan image in the center of a temple. And so the Romans always thought Jewish practice to be very strange, but they respected it to a degree because of its antiquity. In the year 37 BC, Herod the Great comes to power, and I believe he was married to a Hasmonean princess, and he deposes the sort of last sort of puppet ruler that the Romans had set up, and he is proclaimed king of Judea by the Roman Senate and rules Judea as a client kingdom of the Roman Senate and later of the Emperor Augustus himself. Herod is a very fascinating figure. He's not originally Jewish. He's actually Idumean, which is a descendant of the ancient kingdom of Edom, which Edom is the kingdom that was founded by Jacob's brother Esau. And so Herod's family, though, converts to Judaismos. And he's a rather wily figure who survives a number of different political upheavals during his reign. And we obviously know him best as the slaughterer of the innocents in Bethlehem from the Christmas story. He was a very cruel man towards the end of his life, and was both incredibly cultured and sophisticated, and at the same time a cruel tyrant. And Augustus himself rather loathed Herod at the end of Herod's life. So that brings us to the various factions of the Jews that existed in the first century. But any questions before we move on?
Yeah, I just want to mention about Pompey, the guy. I know he desecrated the temple and all that and all those horrible things. Didn't he die a horrible death? Like, didn't God get back at him in like judgment?
Yeah, so he did. Does anybody know who Pompey the Great's son-in-law was? Gaius Julius Caesar, or as we would say, Julius Caesar. And so Pompey was part of the first triumvirate. And so Pompey, Caesar, and Marcus Licinius Crassus formed a sort of three-headed ruling council over the city of Rome after the time of Sulla. And so this is the beginnings of the end of the Roman Republic and the beginnings of the Roman Empire. And eventually there is a civil war because Caesar refuses to relinquish his army in Gaul. And as he marches from Gaul into Italy, he crosses what river? For all of our history nerds out there, he crosses the Rubicon.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You're thinking about the famous, maybe the great depiction of it in the HBO series Rome, where he's yelling to his soldiers, "Our republic is in the hands of madmen," and by crossing the Rubicon and refusing to relinquish his army before setting foot in Italy, Caesar is essentially declaring civil war against the Senate. And so Pompey is the champion of the Senate, and Caesar defeats Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. And Pompey flees to Egypt, which was part of the Ptolemaic Empire at that point. And does anybody know who is ruling the Ptolemaic Empire during the times of the civil wars at the end of the Republic?
Just a wild guess, maybe Cleopatra.
That's correct. Yes, Cleopatra. It's all coming together now, right? And so he flees to the court of Cleopatra, and people in her court actually assassinate Pompey as he arrives in Egypt, and they cut off his head, and they send it to Caesar. And when Caesar arrives, he proceeds to kill all of the assassins because he said he was a consul of Rome. And how dare this foreign kingdom insult a Roman? So even though Caesar and Pompey had become mortal enemies, Caesar still respected the fact that Pompey was a Roman citizen and a family member, and so he punished the people who assassinated his greatest political rival. That's the kind of, I guess, loyalty that the Romans had to the Roman state at that time. But yes, Pompey is defeated, and later by Julius Caesar, and then obviously, we can talk about that next week when we talk about, sort of Greco-Roman, the Greco-Roman background of the Christian Church. All right, so we move on. We're going to talk about the heresies of the Jewish religion. And so I use this term heresies in particular. Does anybody know what a heresy is in the ancient context? Now, we think about heresy today as somebody who believes like false doctrine and they're going to hell and all that kind of stuff. But what was a heresy in the first century when that term is used?
Sure.
So a heresy is actually just a party or a faction. So a sect would be kind of the term that we would use today. And that was the original sort of meaning of a heresy. And so Josephus, in his famous Antiquity of the Jews, mentions three primary heresies. And of course, Josephus is writing in Greek, or parties that dominated Jewish religious life in the first century. And you guys have probably heard of at least two of these and maybe a third. We have the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. And so we'll begin with the Sadducees. So the Sadducees, the term derives from the Greek word Saddukaioi, which is originally from the Hebrew term Zadok, Zadok being one of the priests of the temple. And Zadok also happens, in addition to being a personal name, it's the Hebrew word for righteous. And so the word Sadducee implied somebody who was of a pure lineage of Judean heritage, whether that be a priestly or Levitical status, or even somebody who was just of the tribe of Judah, but they had no sort of Gentile ancestry. And so the Sadducees arose during the Hasmonean period, and the Hasmonean dynasty, as I mentioned earlier, was a priestly dynasty. So the kings of the Hasmonean dynasty were actually descended from Aaron. They were actually priests under Jewish law. And so the office of high priest was no longer just a religious office, but it very much became a political one. And so the partisans, or the sectarians, who were primarily made up of priests and Levites, the sort of upper crust of Judean society of that time, the religious and political elite. They weren't strictly priests and Levites, but they were priests and Levites and the people who sort of supported them. The aristocracy were generally Sadducean in their affiliation. And you can see this nice anachronistic inlay from the 15th century here from the Nuremberg Chronicle of a Sadducee. So unlike the more popular Pharisees, the Sadducees were favored by the political and religious elites, as well as the Roman government and the Herodian dynasty, as they were amenable clients to help govern the people. So the Sadducees were basically in cahoots with both Herod and with the Roman governor, and basically formed the ruling party of the Jewish people in the Holy Land in the first century. And for them, from a religious standpoint, the written Torah alone was the source of religious authority, and that's significant. I didn't say the written Tanakh, I said the written Torah, because like the Samaritans, the Sadducees actually limited their canon of scripture to just the 5 books of Moses. And that was their form of religious authority. And we see this conflict in several cases with Jesus. And we'll get into that in later lessons. Now we contrast the Sadducees with the Pharisees, or the Perushim, which literally means the separated ones in Hebrew. Why were they called the separated ones? Well, the Pharisees, as you may have kind of picked up on in your readings of the New Testament, they were separating themselves from any and all non-Jewish influence. They especially hated the Hellenistic or the Greek influence that existed within the Holy Land. They also were not kind towards Samaritans, and they also did not like the profane sort of practices of the hoi polloi, the sort of Jewish mass, the sort of, less than devout, practices of the common Jews, whom they actually referred to by the same phrase that the Bible refers to the Canaanites in the Old Testament, and that is the Am Haaretz, that is the people of the land, which is interesting because the Pharisees were actually supported by the common Jewish masses over against the Sadducees, who were seen as religious elites. And so even though they separated themselves from the sort of common rabble of the Jewish people, think about sinners and tax collectors. Why does this man eat with sinners and tax collectors? That's the exact kind of phrase that a Pharisee would say. Oddly enough, when it came to religion, the common people supported the Pharisees by and large over the Sadducees. They were primarily from the Jewish, what we would call middle class, so merchants, artisans, and teachers. Think about the Apostle Paul. What was his profession in the New Testament?
He was a merchant, right?
Yeah, he was a tent maker, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a skenosen in the Greek. Maybe that's the wrong conjugation of the word, but it's literally a tent maker. And so he would have been an artisan, somebody who had sort of what we would think of as like a skilled tradesman, like electricians or plumbers or, general contractors, the sort of not necessarily the lowest of the low, but the sort of talented people who made society go. Neither the religious and political elite, nor the impoverished masses, but the class of the merchants and the artisans and the rabbis. And they also arose in the aftermath of the Maccabean revolt. And their main distinguishing feature was a belief not just in the written Torah, unlike the Sadducees, but in the oral Torah, the traditions that came from Moses and the elders of Israel, which, as you know, brought them into direct conflict with our Lord and his ministry. And their form of Judaism provided the basis of the Talmud, as I mentioned earlier, and they are the direct theological progenitors of modern Judaism. And so I had a conversation with an Orthodox Jew once, and he said, "We are the Parushim." And he basically said, "We are the Pharisees." And they take that as a badge of honor, as opposed to being a Christian. And so just a brief overview, comparison of Pharisaical and Sadduceical beliefs. The Sadducees were focused primarily on the temple in Jerusalem. The Pharisees were out in the diaspora in the synagogues. The Sadducees were aristocratic. The Pharisees were from the middle class. The Sadducees were very much pro-Roman and pro-Herod. The Pharisees were very much anti-Roman and barely tolerated Herod. The Sadducees held to the written Pentateuch alone, whereas the Pharisees not only held to the written Pentateuch, but held to the entire written Old Testament and also their oral body of traditions. The Sadducees subsequently did not believe in the bodily resurrection, and that's hinted at or directly addressed in Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 through 33. Whereas the Pharisees did believe in a bodily resurrection. When the Apostle Paul was on trial in front of the Sanhedrin, the great council there in Jerusalem, he perceived that some of them were of the Pharisaical party and others were Sadducees. And so in order to cause confusion, he said, I am a Pharisee and the son of Pharisee, and I am on trial for the resurrection of the dead. And this caused a great disputation among the members of the Sanhedrin, because some of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees who rejected Paul's doctrine and others were Pharisees. And so Paul actually was able to escape with his life by causing a dissension in the great council. The Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife, and the Pharisees not only believed in an afterlife, they believed in angels and messengers and all of the things that we think about as well as Christians in the divine sense. What about this third group, the Essenes? This is a group that is not mentioned in the New Testament. This is a more obscure faction that is mentioned by Josephus, who were very ascetic. So they kind of like to hide out in the desert like monks. And they had a very apocalyptic outlook on religion. So there's a lot of literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll talk about in a second, that talks about a coming Messiah and a coming sort of golden age and the end of the world. And so there's some interesting parallels to teachings that we see in, say, the book of Revelation in the literature of the Essenes. Scholars have tried to connect them to John the Baptist being out there in the wilderness as well as our Lord, but without any definitive success. They had a number of practices of ritual purity, including a form of baptism, which was the Jewish mikvah, where they would dip people into ritual baths for purity. And they had a strict adherence to the Torah. They were hostile to the religious elite in Jerusalem, whom they saw as hypocritical in their form of religion. And their greatest contribution to history is actually came 1900 years after they disappeared, with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the modern-day West Bank, right near the Dead Sea, by a Bedouin shepherd boy in 1946. The Dead Sea Scrolls are comprised of 15,000 manuscripts and manuscript fragments of the Old Testament, apocryphal works, as well as first-century sectarian literature that is connected to the Essenes. And as early as the 2nd century BC, 1,000 years earlier than the previously oldest Hebrew Masoretic text, we actually have Hebrew copies of the Old Testament from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were preserved by the Essenes. So this is very important for textual critical studies and is one of the great finds of the 20th century. Talk a little bit about Jewish life, and don't worry, guys, we're going to be finishing up here in the next few minutes. The Sanhedrin has to be mentioned. There are two different forms of Sanhedrin, and so that's the Greek term, the sitting together or assembly, where the Hebrew term Sanhedrin comes from. It's actually a loan word from the Greek. You have the lesser, the Katan Sanhedrins. These were local councils of about 23 leaders in a town or a region that would be called together to govern local affairs. And then you had the greater or the Gadol Sanhedrin. This was the Sanhedrin that was mentioned in the New Testament, where you had the 70 leaders in Jerusalem who met every day, as Josephus describes, in the Hall of Hewn Stones, except on the Sabbath and on the great feast days. So this Sanhedrin was composed of the priests, Levites, and prominent Jews with pure non-Gentile lineage. So think about Gamaliel the Pharisee. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, along with Joseph of Arimathea, as well as Nicodemus. So these were the leaders of Israel, and here's a rendering of the Sanhedrin over here. Legend has it that they were the successors of the 70 elders of Israel from the time of Moses, so Exodus chapter 24 and Numbers chapter 11. However, the Sanhedrin actually seems to have probably emerged once again during the Hasmonean period. It had authority in religious matters, but did not have the authority to punish capital crimes. That was reserved for the Roman civil authorities, and that's significant for the narratives of the crucifixion that we see in the Gospels. The synagogue, as mentioned previously, after the destruction of the first temple and the Babylonian exile, the center of Jewish life shifted from Jerusalem to the local level because the temple was gone and the Jews were no longer in Jerusalem. And so these started as sort of local assemblies that over time formalized into what we now know as the synagogue. Here's an example of a first century synagogue over here in the northern Israeli town of Gamla. This is, once again, kind of a ruin, but it gives us an idea of, sort of the scale of the synagogue in the first century around the time of Jesus. And then here is a modern synagogue that's actually in New York City, and it's rather ornate. And so the synagogue has been a center of Jewish life from the time of the exile until today. It existed alongside the Second Temple and outlasted the Second Temple and has become the spiritual center, the educational center, as well as a community space for Jews to this day. They are traditionally built facing Jerusalem to orient the Jewish people toward the Promised Land. And as we see in the Gospels, as well as in the epistles of the New Testament, that Jesus and his apostles often taught in the synagogue. And it was the first place of their evangelistic and missionary efforts as they traveled across the known world. So now we're becoming starting to get to the part where Gentiles begin to enter the story. So as the Jewish diaspora spread throughout the known world, many Gentiles were attracted to Judaism, especially in the Greco-Roman world, because of what they saw as the vanity and vapidness of, Stoicism or Epicureanism or the various Greek philosophies, as well as the just sort of moral decay and infidelity of popular paganism. Think about, drunken festivals like the Bacchanalia. And so there were a number of Gentiles who eschewed pagan religion as well as philosophy, and found within Judaismos a form of devotion to God that they thought was more pure. And so proselytes, or garim, this is from the Hebrew term for sojourners that we see in the Old Testament. These were also called the Gentiles of righteousness. These were people who were full converts to Judaism, who were circumcised and bound to follow all of the Jewish law. We know Jesus chides the Pharisees that they would go all across the world to find one proselyte, and yet they would make him twice as much a son of hell as they themselves. And he called them blind guides of the blind. But this term, proselyte, they held a special status within Jewish society, and that they were essentially considered to be Jews from a religious perspective, even though ethnically they were still recognized as being non-Jewish. But among the Gentiles who were attracted to Judaism, a larger number, even the proselytes, were the so-called Theosebes, or the God-fearers. And this comes from Psalm chapter 115, verse 11, you who fear God. These were also called the Gentiles of the Gate. So they were Gentiles who worshiped the God of Israel and would attend the synagogue. So an example of this would be Cornelius, the centurion, but they were not circumcised and they weren't obliged to follow all of the especially ceremonial aspects of the Jewish law. Many of the earliest Gentile converts to Christianity were from this God-fearing class within the Jewish synagogue. And this word survives today as a euphemism for somebody who we see as honestly religious. So somebody is, quote unquote, God-fearing, even if they may not be a member of true religion or have, a fullness of the faith. And so, with the cultural backdrop, I just want to talk for a moment about the beginnings of the end of Jewish life around the time of Jesus, at least as it pertained to the Holy Land. And this sort of sets the stage for the rest of Jewish history. There were three great wars between Jews and their Roman overlords in the first and second centuries AD. The first of which was in 66 through 70 AD. This started in May of the year 66 when a Greek living next to a synagogue in Caesarea sacrificed pigeons to the pagan gods in front of the synagogue there in Caesarea. This sparked a riot. The ensuing violence spiraled out of control, which led to the governor Decius Florus to flee, and then the governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, marched south from Damascus, I believe, is either Damascus or Antioch, but his army was destroyed at the pass of Beth Horon, leading the Emperor Nero to order Vespasian to the region to quell the revolt. And this led to a 4-year-long war of attrition that was an absolutely devastating war for the Jewish people. But it also coincided with a time of upheaval within the Roman Empire. The year of the four emperors being in 69 AD, or 68 and 69 AD, Nero committed suicide in the year 68 AD, June of that year, after the Roman Senate turned against him. And there was a very quick succession of four emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and then finally Vespasian himself, who was the commander of the armies in the east, decided to seize the throne over against Vitellius. And Vespasian wins the civil war. He goes to Rome and he leaves Titus, the future Emperor Titus, in Jerusalem in 70 AD to finish off the campaign. And on that fateful day, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, roughly corresponding to August, the second temple was destroyed by legend on the exact same day that the first temple was destroyed. And during this time, the Christians, with the book of Revelation probably in hand, fled to Pella, which is in modern-day Jordan, to escape the impending war. And so this is the beginnings of the split between the church and the synagogue, because the Christians were seen as being disloyal to the local population there in Judea. And here is an inset of the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, by the German 19th century painter Wilhelm von Kaulbach. This is mentioned by Philip Schaff on page 335 of History of the Christian Church, Volume 1, where here is, I believe, the high priest thrusting a sword into his own bosom as you see the temple being burned and the Jewish people are being cast down. And up here are the angels, and then I believe these are the apostles looking down upon the righteous judgment of God upon unbelieving Israel. And so the Christians saw in the destruction of Jerusalem divine retribution and a fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus had given during the week of his passion. Well, about a generation or so later, there was a second war called the Kitos War from 115 to 117. The Emperor Trajan, who was the second of the five good emperors, was fighting the Parthians in the east. And as he was doing this, the Jews of Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus revolted over the Jewish tax that had been implemented in the aftermath of the First Jewish-Roman War. Jews massacred much of the population in Libya and had some initial success in Egypt before the Greek population, along with the Egyptian peasantry, and the Roman citizens that were there in Alexandria repulsed the Jews. And Roman generals Marcus Turbo and then Lucius Quietus, whose name in Greek is essentially transliterated as Kitos, ended up suppressing that revolt, and Kitos in particular brutally suppressed the revolt in Judea. And then the final straw for the Jews in the Holy Land for the next 1,800 years was the very tragic Bar Kokhba revolt. This was the final war, which was led by a false messiah named Simon Bar Kokhba, who was supported by the famous Rabbi Akiba, who's one of the more cited rabbis in the Talmud. And this was the most brutal of the three conflicts. A short-lived independent Jewish theocracy was actually established from 132 to 135 AD under Shimon as the Nasi, or the prince. A well-organized resistance led by Simon Bar Kokhba held out for 3 years, but the Emperor Hadrian, who is the Emperor Trajan's younger cousin, finally suppressed the revolt at the fortress Beitar in the modern West Bank under his general Sextus Julius Severus. He sent 6 legions, which is about 36,000 men of regular Roman armies, in addition to tens of thousands of auxiliaries. And they absolutely devastated the local population. There was nearly a complete depopulation of Judea at that time. I think there were tens of thousands of Jews sold into slavery in Rome, and Hadrian was so angry at the Jews that he actually renamed the province after their ancient enemies, the Philistines. So he renamed the province Syria Palestina, which is where we get our term Palestine. And he changed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina and converted the site of the temple into a temple to Jupiter. And so Jews were forbidden from setting foot inside of Jerusalem, and they would not become a majority of the inhabitants of the Holy Land again until the 20th century. And so from that day until now, the Jews have had a long and tumultuous, but often heroic history as well. Their conditions within the Roman Empire worsened after the empire was officially converted to Christianity under Theodosius in 381 AD. And in the 1900 years since the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jewish diaspora has basically spread to every corner of the globe. They're divided today into 2 major branches: Sephardic Jews, Sepharad, which is or Sfarad, which is Spain in Hebrew. And so these are Jews of the Spanish Rite. So Jews who are originating from like Spain and Portugal, as well as other places in Southern Europe, like Italy and Greece, as well as North Africa and Asia. The Mizrahim are a sort of sub-branch of Sephardic Jews. And so these Jews all have a similar culture and a similar post-diasporic history. They spoke a Hebrew-Spanish hybrid language called Ladino, and had their sort of own traditions and customs. And then you have Jews that are probably more familiar to you. These are Ashkenazim, or the Ashkenazi Jews, or German Jews. So these are the Jews of Northern and Eastern Europe. The Jews were finally emancipated after about 1,700 years, or after about 1,600 years of oppression by Napoleon, who allowed Jews religious freedom for the first time in the modern era in Europe. The Jewish experience of faith and survival has been one amidst great persecution, and they are one of the most recognizable communities in the world today. There's many pivotal figures. Here's Moses Maimonides up here. You can see the new $1 shekel, so shekel hadash achad. So this is the $1 bill there in Israel. And this is the great Moses Maimonides. He was a Jewish polymath and rabbi known by Jews today as the Rambam, who lived in Egypt in 1200 AD. Very important for medieval Jewish thought. Other important Jews, men like Bel Shem Tov, who founded Hasidic Judaism in sort of modern-day Ukraine and around the year 1700. There was Theodore Herzl, who is the leader of the Zionist movement, David Ben-Gurion, as well as many scientists and philosophers and artists. These are just some scenes from Jewish history from then until now. Obviously, a very famous Jew in our own context in the United States was Albert Einstein, a very famous physicist. We have a scene from the Holocaust here. This is a scene from medieval Europe. I kind of want to make a controversial statement, but not sure if we want to get into it. Does anybody know why this is a circle? The badge that the Jews were required to wear was a circle.
Is it like a letter or something?
So the German word for circle is Keikel. And in the medieval period, Jews were distinguished by wearing special clothing. They were actually forced to wear special clothing. And when they would sign their names, you would often, put your mark on a legal document, and most people would sign with an X. But an X looked like a cross. And so Jews would not put an X because that was a Christian symbol and was considered idolatrous. And so they would write a circle. And so Jews came to be known as Keikel, and there is a ethnic slur of Jews today that is derived from the German word Keikel, and I'll leave that to your imagination as to what that word is. Yes, this was just one of the many scenes of, sort of persecution and humiliation that Jews were subject to over the various centuries. So some of the challenges that we face within Christianity today, I know that Brother Stafford is really going to enjoy this slide here. We have the popular reappearance of anti-Semitism. Do you recognize some of these figures, Jonah?
Oh, yes, I do.
So obviously Jews are even in the news today, and there has certainly been a popular reappearance of anti-Semitism, especially in the age of social media. Whether it be the Groyper movement or figures like Candace Owens, the Tate brothers. Here we have Fresh and Fit, our own Joel Webbin up here, who is accused of anti-Semitism, and then obviously Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson right here. This is a major challenge. Jews feel under assault and under threat. But we also have to recognize that real theological differences and a history of interfaith hostility still turns many Jews away from having a listening ear to the Christian gospel. Here's a Jewish account on X that once again is referencing the oral Torah over against the written scriptures. And here's a very famous Jewish anti-Christian polemicist by the name of Rabbi Tovia Singer, who his mission in life is to essentially prevent Jews from converting to Christianity. And he's one of the most vocal and most well-recognized sort of Jewish apologists today. And so there are many challenges that we as Christians face in our interactions with Jews. But we continue to pray with Romans 11 that all Israel would be saved. And we believe in the promises of God that even amongst the natural branches, that not everyone is broken off. So with that, I'll finish with a personal story as well as a Philip Schaff quote. So Schaff writes in History of the Christian Church, "This is the Jewish religion, as it flowed from the fountain of divine revelation and lived in the true Israel, the spiritual children of Abraham in John the Baptist, his parents and disciples, and the mother of Jesus, her kindred and friends, and the venerable Simeon and the prophetess Anna, and Lazarus and his pious sisters, in the apostles and the first disciples, who embraced Jesus of Nazareth as the fulfiller of the law and the prophets, the Son of God and the Savior of the world, and who were the first fruits of the Christian church." And this topic has a lot of personal significance to me. This is a picture of actually my biological paternal grandfather on the right, who was a Ashkenazi Jew. I find many of these issues to be very acute in the world today, especially as we see all the discussion online about the influence of Jews in society and these sorts of things. And what we have to remember is that God did choose the old covenant people for a reason, and that was to bring forth the Messiah. And even though many Jews today are resistant to the message of the gospel, that in his providence and in his electing grace, there are those of the natural branch whom God, even to this day, still brings to salvation. And so we as Christians should not hate the Jews. We should not persecute them, even as we recognize their enmity and their hostility towards the gospel. But we should pray for our Jewish friends and neighbors and relatives, that they too would see Jesus as Messiah. And with that, I want to finish off with a little video just about the Jews, and just to sort of, in a pithy way, encapsulate their all of the things that we've kind of talked about today, and the persistence of their people.
A fiddler on the roof. Sounds crazy, no? But here, in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so dangerous? Well, we stay because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition!
And of course, does everyone know what film that is from?
It's the Fiddler on the Roof.
Fiddler
right?
on the Roof. That's right. And that is how the Jews to this day have survived as a distinct people, is in fact the Jewish tradition that they hold so dear. And it remains one of the greatest obstacles to the gospel on the other end. So does anybody have any final questions before we hang up for the night?
Yeah, I wanted to go back a little bit when you were talking about the Ashkenazi Jew thing.
Yeah.
I was looking it up on the internet, and in Genesis chapter 10, verse 3, it says the sons of Gomer, Ashkenazi, Rehath, and Togarmah. I noticed obviously that the names in there, but I forget why the scholars named the Eastern Jews like Ashkenazi. I wanted you to maybe touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think this comes from rabbinical tradition, and it's not that Ashkenaz was definitively Germany, But in sort of medieval Jewish thought, that Ashkenaz was sort of associated with Germany and sort of Northern Europe. And so, as opposed to Sephardic Jews from Sfarad, which was Spain, the Jews of Northern Europe, who were a very distinct, a distinct population with their own history and their own development, came to be known as Ashkenazim because of this sort of association, at least, in sort of a metaphorical, figurative, best guess, sort of sense as to where Ashkenaz was. That's where the term comes from. But you're right that it comes originally from that passage in Genesis.
Yeah, I was just looking it up because I was like, where's this even from? But yeah, that was super cool. And you showed a picture of your grandpa. You said that was your grandpa.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's super cool. If I could find any pictures of my 5th great grandfather, that'd be cool.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting. Well, I'll go ahead and end the recording at this point.